If you ask a reader to picture the ultimate romantic fantasy of the struggling writer, they will almost always describe 1920s post-war Paris. We picture brilliant, impoverished expatriates huddled over espresso at outdoor cafe tables, crafting masterpieces between glasses of cheap wine. This enduring image comes almost entirely from one book, A Moveable Feast. But this youthful energy masks a tragic discrepancy. Ernest Hemingway didn't write this in his 20s. He drafted it between 1957 and 1960 as an aging, deeply paranoid, and creatively blocked man. The catalyst for the project arrived in 1956. Management at the Paris Ritz convinced Hemingway to retrieve 2 vintage steamer trunks he had left in their basement nearly 30 years earlier. When he opened the lids, he found stacks of forgotten, handwritten notebooks from his youth. Reading through his old observations triggered a flood of vivid memories from the most formative years of his life. Yet in the preface to the resulting memoir, this author, who famously championed objective truth in literature, explicitly told his audience that the book could be read as fiction. He wasn't trying to write an accurate historical record. He was actively constructing a myth to rescue himself from his own physical and mental decline. To build that myth, Hemingway had to return to 1920s Paris and heavily romanticize the severe poverty he experienced with his first wife, Hadley. In his retelling, starvation was never a threat. When he had to skip meals because they couldn't afford food, he framed the hunger as a strict, almost holy discipline that sharpened his senses and clarified his perception of the world. If we visualize his famous iceberg theory of writing, the concept is simple but punishing. A writer should omit obvious details, leaving only the bare, visible tip of the story on the page, while the massive, unspoken emotional weight rests quietly beneath the surface. He claimed this exact technique was inspired by staring at Paul Cézanne's paintings at the Louvre, trying to understand how the artist captured the pure, strict essence of a landscape without relying on obvious tricks. Looking back as an older man whose words were failing him, Hemingway needed this version of the story to be true. He needed to prove to himself that intense physical hardship is the direct, necessary catalyst for creating revolutionary art. The memoir served another purpose beyond defending his own work ethic. Hemingway used his highly selective memory to settle decades-old scores with his contemporaries. He turns his pen on Gertrude Stein, the early mentor who coined the term lost generation to describe young veterans. Hemingway portrays her as an elitist whose comfortable life allowed her to make broad, patronizing generalizations. He is equally brutal to F. Scott Fitzgerald. Hemingway paints a heartbreaking, deeply condescending portrait of a staggering genius ruined by his own insecurities, severe alcohol abuse, and a jealous wife. By tearing down these cultural giants, Hemingway reinforces his own central narrative. He positions himself as the lone, disciplined survivor among a generation of incredibly talented but ultimately weak-willed artists. This aggressive posturing eventually gives way to a crushing tonal shift. When the narrative moves to their winter trips in Schruns, Austria, we see the absolute peak of Hemingway's innocence and his uncorrupted happiness with Hadley. Then the idyllic poverty shatters. Hemingway details how the rich, specifically Pauline Pfeiffer, who would become his second wife, infiltrate their quiet life and fracture his first marriage. The sudden drop from joyful nostalgia to haunting regret exposes the true vulnerability of the author. In these final pages, he is mourning the end of his marriage, but he is also grieving the death of the pure, disciplined writer he used to be. That grief pulls us straight out of the Parisian myth and back into the bleak reality of 1961. Reconnecting with these vibrant early memories was not enough to cure his severe depression. Before he could write a final chapter or settle on a title, Hemingway died by suicide, leaving the manuscript unfinished. When published in 1964, the book arrived with massive controversy. His widow, Mary, had heavily edited the text, blurring the line between truth and fiction. Today, scholars don't treat it as an accurate diary, but as a heavily curated construction of identity. This brings us to the core metaphor of the title. For Hemingway, Paris ceased to be a physical coordinate on a map. It became an internalized sanctuary. If you build a strong enough foundation of discipline, passion, and artistic rigor in your youth, it becomes a movable feast. It is a reservoir of strength that you can carry with you and draw from to psychologically sustain you wherever you go, right up until the very end.